It wasn't an explosion that ended the greatest empire in human history. It was a silence, and in that silence, the world changed forever. Today, millions walk past the bones of Rome without hearing the whisper it left behind, a warning written in marble and blood, carved into the very foundations of Western civilization, from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to the Black Sea. Rome's shadow still stretches across continents, but shadows are all that remain of an empire that once believed itself eternal. Stand in the Colosseum at dawn when the tourist crowds haven't yet arrived and listen. The silence is deafening. Once, 50,000 voices roared in this arena. Emperors acknowledged the crowd's cheers. Gladiators fought and died for Rome's entertainment. Lions prowled where pigeons now nest. The marble that gleamed white under Mediterranean sun now crumbles gray under centuries of neglect. Walk through the Roman Forum, where Cicero delivered orations that shaped Western rhetoric, where Caesar planned the conquest of Gaul, where senators debated the fate of nations. Grass grows between ancient stones. Tourists take selfies where empires once fell. The Via Sacra, the sacred way that once witnessed triumph parades of victorious generals, now hosts vendors selling plastic gladiator helmets made in China. Drive across Europe and you're driving on Roman roads. The Appian Way still carries traffic after 2,300 years. Roman bridges still span rivers from England to Romania. Roman aqueducts still supply water to modern cities, but these monuments survive as fossils, not living institutions. We use Rome's infrastructure while forgetting Rome's lessons. No empire thinks it will fall, not when its legions are victorious, not when its citizens prosper, not when its enemies tremble at the mention of its name. Rome thought itself different. Rome thought itself chosen by the gods. Rome believed it would last forever because it had already lasted longer than any empire before it. The Aeneid, Virgil's epic poem commissioned by Augustus himself, proclaimed Rome's divine mission. Remember, Roman, to rule the peoples with your power, these will be your arts: to impose the custom of peace, to spare the conquered, and to war down the proud. Romans weren't just conquerors. They were civilizers. They weren't just powerful. They were righteous. This belief in their own eternal destiny became Rome's greatest weakness. Empires that expect to fall prepare for succession. Empires that expect to last forever stop preparing for anything at all. But what exactly was this Rome that fell? Was it the city of 7 hills beside the Tiber? Was it the republican government that conquered the Mediterranean? Was it the imperial system that ruled from Scotland to Sudan? Was it the legal framework that organized half the known world? Was it the cultural identity that transformed barbarians into citizens? Rome was all of these things and none of them. Rome was an idea that became an institution, a dream that became reality, a vision that outlived its visionaries. When the Roman Empire fell, it wasn't just a government that collapsed. It was a way of understanding the world, a method of organizing human society, a belief system that had shaped civilization for over a millennium. The fall of Rome represents the largest civilizational collapse in recorded history. No other empire ruled so much territory for so long or left such a profound impact on human development. No other collapse affected so many people across such a vast area or set back human progress so dramatically. Yet Rome's fall wasn't sudden. Empires don't die overnight like people. They decay gradually like ecosystems. The process takes generations, sometimes centuries. By the time contemporaries recognize the collapse, it's already irreversible. Rome was wrong about its eternal destiny, but Romans were right about one thing: their empire would cast shadows across history long after its political death. We speak languages derived from Latin. Our legal systems rest on Roman foundations. Our architectural styles echo Roman models. Our political concepts, republic, senate, citizen, constitution, are Roman words describing Roman innovations. The question isn't whether Rome fell. History settled that debate over 1,500 years ago. The question is why Rome fell, how it fell, and what its fall teaches us about the fragility of all human achievement. This is the story of the greatest empire in human history, and the silence that ended it. 7 hills beside the Tiber River. 753 BC, 2 abandoned infants, Romulus and Remus, suckled by a wolf. Myth became foundation. Foundation became destiny. But Rome's true power was never mythical, it was methodical. The story begins not with divine intervention but with geographic advantage. Rome occupied a perfect strategic position, far enough inland to avoid naval raids, close enough to the sea for trade, positioned on a river crossing that controlled north-south traffic through central Italy. The 7 hills provided natural fortification. The surrounding plains offered fertile farmland. The climate was Mediterranean perfection. Geography explains opportunity. Character explains achievement. The earliest Romans were farmers and warriors, but they were farmers and warriors with a difference, where other Italian tribes raided. For plunder, Romans conquered for incorporation. Where Greeks established colonies that remained separate from local populations, Romans created systems that absorbed conquered peoples into an expanding Roman identity. This was Rome's revolutionary innovation, the concept of earned citizenship. A Sabine could become Roman, a Latin could become Roman, eventually a Gaul could become Roman, a Spaniard could become Roman, an African could become Roman. Citizenship wasn't ethnic, it was civic. You became Roman not by birth but by embracing Roman law, Roman customs, Roman loyalty. The Roman army embodied this inclusive approach. Unlike Greek citizen militias or barbarian war bands, Roman legions combined professional discipline with social mobility. A common soldier could rise through merit to command legions. A provincial auxiliary could earn citizenship through military service. The army that conquered the Mediterranean was recruited from the Mediterranean. By 509 BC, the Romans had expelled their Etruscan kings and created something unprecedented in the ancient world, a republic governed by written law rather than royal whim. The 12 Tables, Rome's first legal code, established principles that would echo through millennia: equality before the law, due process, the right to trial, legal precedent. But early Rome wasn't peaceful or democratic in any modern sense. It was a militaristic society that glorified conquest and subordinated individual desires to collective needs. Roman children learned to read by studying the 12 Tables. Roman boys trained for war from childhood. Roman girls learned to manage households and raise future soldiers. This combination of military excellence and legal innovation made Rome unstoppable. The legions that conquered Italy didn't just defeat enemies, they recruited them. Roman engineering corps didn't just win battles. They built roads, bridges, and fortifications that made conquered territory permanently Roman. Consider Rome's war with Carthage, the Punic Wars that lasted over a century and determined whether Mediterranean civilization would be Roman or Carthaginian. When Hannibal crossed the Alps with elephants and African warriors, he won battle after battle, including the devastating defeat at Cannae where Roman casualties exceeded 70,000 in a single day. Any normal state would have sued for peace. Rome rebuilt its armies and continued fighting. When Hannibal's tactics proved superior, Rome developed new tactics. When Carthaginian naval power threatened Roman supply lines, Rome built a navy from scratch. When traditional recruitment proved insufficient, Rome armed slaves and promised them freedom for faithful service. The Romans called this quality gravitas serious, determined. Unyielding commitment to Roman success that transcended individual survival. Regulus, captured by Carthaginians, was sent to Rome to negotiate prisoner exchanges. Instead, he urged the Senate to reject Carthaginian terms, then returned to Carthage to face torture and death, honoring his promise to his captors while serving Roman interests. Such stories weren't exceptional in early Rome. They were exemplary. They represented the character that conquered the Mediterranean. Roman engineering reflected this same methodical excellence. Roman roads weren't just transportation. They were statements of permanent control. Built to last centuries, constructed with foundations that modern highways rarely match, surveyed with precision that allowed almost straight lines across hundreds of miles, Roman roads announced that Rome had come to stay. Roman aqueducts represented the marriage of engineering skill and civic responsibility, bringing fresh mountain water to cities. These structures required mathematical precision, construction expertise, and enormous public investment. They served not just practical needs but civic pride. A city with Roman aqueducts was a Roman city, enjoying benefits that barbarian settlements couldn't imagine. The Roman legal system evolved from practical necessity into philosophical framework. Early Roman law was harsh and simple, designed for a farming community where everyone knew everyone else. As Rome expanded, legal complexity increased. Provincial governors needed guidelines for ruling diverse populations. Merchants needed standardized contracts for long-distance trade. Urban populations needed dispute resolution mechanisms. Roman jurists developed concepts that remain fundamental to Western law: the presumption of innocence, the burden of proof, the right of appeal, the distinction between civil and criminal law, the principle that punishment should fit the crime. These weren't abstract philosophical concepts but practical tools for managing a diverse empire. By the time Augustus became the first emperor in 27 BC, Rome controlled the entire Mediterranean basin, Mare Nostrum, our sea. 3 continents acknowledged Roman authority. Roman merchants traded from Britain to India. Roman citizens governed from Scotland to Egypt. Roman law settled disputes in dozens of languages across thousands of miles. The Republic had become an empire, but this transformation seemed natural, even inevitable. Romans didn't conquer the Mediterranean to create an empire. They conquered it to defend Rome. Each war was fought to secure previous conquests. Each conquest required new wars to secure new frontiers. Success demanded more success until Rome ruled everything worth ruling. This gradual expansion over centuries created the world's first truly cosmopolitan civilization. A merchant from Spain could do business in Syria using Roman law and Roman currency. A scholar from Egypt could study in Athens and teach in Rome. A soldier from Britain could serve in Germany and retire in Italy. For the first time in human history, the civilized world operated under a single legal, economic, and political system. Rome had achieved something unprecedented, a universal state based on merit rather than birth, law rather than force, citizenship rather than subjection. The Roman Empire represented humanity's first successful attempt to create a multi-ethnic, multinational, multicultural civilization. This achievement would never be repeated. The Golden Age and the arrogance of power Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For 2 centuries, from Augustus to Marcus Aurelius, the Mediterranean world knew a stability it had never experienced and would never know again. Trade flowed freely from Britain to India. Greek philosophy merged with Roman pragmatism. Art flourished. Literature soared. Science advanced. Cities grew. Population expanded. Prosperity reached levels that wouldn't return to Europe for over 1,000 years. Under Augustus, the empire stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, from the Sahara to the Rhine. Roman legions stood guard on Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain while other Roman soldiers patrolled the Nile cataracts in southern Egypt. A single emperor's authority extended over territories that encompassed modern England, France, Spain, Italy, Greece, Turkey, Syria, Israel, Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Romania, and parts of Germany. This vast domain wasn't held together by force alone. Roman citizenship became the most coveted prize in the ancient world. Cities competed to earn Roman colonial status. Provincial elites sent their sons to Rome for education. Local languages gave way to Latin in the west, Greek in the east. Roman architectural styles spread to every corner of the empire. Hadrian, emperor from 117 to 138 AD, embodied this cosmopolitan Roman spirit. Born in Spain to Roman colonists, he spoke fluent Greek, wrote poetry, designed buildings, founded cities, and traveled continuously throughout his domains. His wall across northern Britain and his rebuilt Pantheon in Rome represent the 2 faces of Roman achievement: military engineering that controlled space and civic architecture that inspired souls. Trajan's Column in Rome, completed in 113 AD, stands 126 feet tall and contains a spiral frieze depicting the emperor's victories in Dacia. The sculptural narrative winds around the column 23 times, containing over 2,600 human figures in scenes of battle, negotiation, construction, and celebration. This isn't just artistic decoration. It's imperial propaganda of unprecedented sophistication, telling Romans that their empire brought civilization to barbarian lands. But the Pax Romana concealed growing problems beneath its magnificent surface. The Roman economy had become dependent on conquest. For centuries, successful wars had paid for themselves through plunder, slaves, and tribute. Victorious generals returned to Rome with enough wealth to fund public works, distribute largesse to citizens, and finance the next campaign. This cycle of conquest funding conquest had powered Roman expansion for 500 years. Under the Pax Romana, expansion stopped. The frontiers stabilized along defensible boundaries: the Rhine and Danube rivers in Europe, the Sahara Desert in Africa, the Euphrates River in Asia. These borders made military sense, but they eliminated the plunder that had funded previous expansion. Now the legions became a cost rather than an investment. Standing armies required regular pay, equipment, supplies, and infrastructure. Border fortifications needed construction and maintenance. Provincial administration required bureaucrats and officials. The empire that had grown rich through conquest now faced the expense of defending what it had already won. Augustus had established 28 legions to guard the frontiers. Each legion contained approximately 5,000 professional soldiers plus auxiliary troops, engineers, cavalry, and support personnel. The total military force approached 300,000 men under arms, the largest professional army in human history to that point. This military machine consumed enormous resources. Legionaries received regular salary, retirement bonuses, and veteran benefits. They ate imported grain, war-manufactured equipment, and used weapons forged in specialized armories. They required roads for movement, forts for housing, hospitals for treatment, and supply depots for sustenance. The cost of imperial defense forced changes in Roman society that would prove fatal to Roman character. Roman citizens, once proud to serve in the legions, increasingly avoided military duty. Why risk death on distant frontiers? When peaceful prosperity was available at home, military service, which had once been the path to citizenship and advancement, became a burden that wealthy families avoided through substitutes or bribes. The citizen soldiers who had conquered Gaul and defeated Carthage were gradually replaced by provincial auxiliaries and barbarian foederati. These professional warriors were often superior fighters to the Roman citizens they replaced, but they fought for pay rather than patriotism, for gold rather than glory. Urban Romans developed a taste for luxury that would have shocked their ancestors. Private bathhouses became common in wealthy households. Exotic foods arrived from across the empire: silk from China, spices from India, ivory from Africa, amber from the Baltic. Roman banquets featured dozens of courses and entertainment that cost more than most people earned in lifetimes. The Emperor Caligula allegedly made his horse a consul and built a floating bridge across the Bay of Naples just so he could ride across it wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate. While this story may be exaggerated, it reflects the disconnect between imperial resources and rational priorities that characterized later Roman rule. Nero fiddled while Rome burned, probably a myth, since fiddles hadn't been invented. But he did build an enormous palace, the Domus Aurea, that covered over 200 acres in central Rome. Its dining rooms had rotating ceilings that showered guests with flower petals. Its corridors were decorated with gold leaf and precious gems. Its gardens contained artificial lakes and imported wild animals, bread and circuses. Pain met circenses, the poet Juvenal's bitter observation that the Roman people, once sovereign citizens of a republic, now cared only for free food and free entertainment. The government that had once been accountable to citizen soldiers now bought the loyalty of urban mobs through subsidized grain and spectacular gladiatorial games. The Colosseum, completed under Emperor Titus in 80 AD, could hold 50,000 spectators for gladiatorial combats, wild animal hunts, naval battles, and public executions. The opening games lasted 100 days and featured the deaths of over 2,000 gladiators and 9,000 animals. Romans who had once conquered nations now spent their days watching others fight and die for entertainment. This transformation from citizen to spectator reflected a deeper change in Roman values. The early Romans had worshipped virtues: courage, discipline, duty, sacrifice for the common good. Imperial Romans worshipped success, wealth, pleasure, status, individual advancement. The Roman elite retreated into luxury that would make modern billionaires blush. Villas sprawled across entire hillsides. Private art collections contained treasures looted from Greece and Egypt. Household slaves numbered in the hundreds. Some wealthy Romans owned multiple estates across the empire, managed by stewards, while the owners lived in Rome pursuing political advancement or social pleasure. Marcus Crassus, one of the richest Romans of the late Republic, owned over 7,000 slaves and real estate worth 200 million sestertii, equivalent to billions in modern currency. He made his fortune through a private fire brigade that would negotiate prices while buildings burned, often buying property at fire sale prices from desperate owners. The emperors themselves embodied this transformation from republican virtue to imperial excess. Augustus had lived modestly and worked constantly. Diocletian, 3 centuries later, lived in a palace larger than most cities and required visitors to prostrate themselves in his presence. The emperor, who had once been first citizen, became an oriental despot ruling through ceremony and fear. Roman religion followed the same trajectory from civic duty to personal indulgence. Early Romans had worshipped gods who protected the state: Mars for war, Minerva for wisdom, Ceres for agriculture. Imperial Romans worshipped gods who promised individual salvation: Mithras, Isis, eventually Christ. The Senate still met in its ancient chamber, but real power lay with the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal army stationed in Rome. These soldiers, supposedly Rome's elite protectors, auctioned the imperial throne to the highest. Bitter in 193 AD, Didius Julianus bought the empire for 25,000 sestertii per guardsman, roughly equivalent to buying the United States presidency for 50 billion. When Emperor Commodus fought as a gladiator in the Colosseum, it wasn't courage that motivated him, it was decadence. When he declared himself the reincarnation of Hercules and appeared in public wearing a lion's skin, it wasn't divine inspiration but madness. The line between emperor and entertainer had dissolved, and Rome applauded its own degradation. The Antonine Plague, which struck the empire from 165 to 180 AD, killed an estimated 5 million people, including Emperor Marcus Aurelius himself. But rather than spurring reform or renewal, the plague simply accelerated existing trends toward fatalism and escapism. Romans had lost confidence in their ability to shape their destiny. By 180 AD, the Roman Empire had achieved everything Romans had ever dreamed of achieving. It was the largest, richest, most powerful state in human history. Its laws governed 3 continents. Its language was spoken from Scotland to Sudan. Its culture influenced every civilized people on earth. This complete success became the source of Rome's destruction. Victory had eliminated external challenges that kept Roman society vigorous. Prosperity had eliminated internal hardships that built Roman character. Achievement had eliminated future goals that motivated Roman effort. Rome had conquered the world, but in conquering the world, Rome had lost its soul. Cracks beneath the marble, internal decay. The enemy wasn't only at the gates, it was in the mirror. By the 3rd century AD, the Roman economy was hemorrhaging from wounds that no amount of military victory could heal. The empire that had once grown wealthy through conquest now consumed its accumulated wealth through consumption. Military campaigns that once paid for themselves through plunder now drained the imperial treasury. The legions, once supplied by conquered wealth, became an enormous burden on a shrinking tax base. 28 legions required approximately 150,000 professional soldiers, plus equal numbers of auxiliaries, support staff, and civilian contractors. This massive military establishment consumed roughly 75% of imperial revenues. Emperors discovered a tempting solution: debase the currency. The silver denarius, once 98% pure silver, contained only 5% silver. By 268 AD, the gold aureus, once the world's most trusted currency, became bronze coins with thin gold plating. Gresham-Mees law operated with ruthless efficiency. Bad money drove good money out of circulation as citizens hoarded real silver and gold while spending debased coins. Inflation destroyed the middle class with mathematical precision. A measure of wheat that cost 2 denarii under Augustus cost 50,000 denarii under Diocletian. An inflation rate of 2,500,000%. A Roman pound of gold, worth 25 denarii under Augustus, cost 2,120,000 denarii under Constantine. These aren't typos. They're the documented collapse of a monetary system. Such hyperinflation made normal economic planning impossible. Farmers couldn't calculate whether spring planting would be profitable by harvest time. Merchants couldn't price goods for delivery months in the future. Workers couldn't save money that might be worthless before they could spend it. Provincial governors facing impossible. Tax demands from Rome resorted to requisitions and confiscations. Army commanders seized supplies directly from farmers rather than purchasing through normal markets. Local officials demanded bribes to avoid arbitrary taxation. The Roman legal system, once famous for protecting property rights, became a mechanism for organized theft. Farmers abandoned their fields rather than pay taxes that exceeded their harvests. Archaeological evidence shows widespread rural abandonment across the empire during the 3rd century. Olive groves in Spain, vineyards in Gaul. Wheat farms in Egypt. Productive agricultural land reverted to wilderness as cultivation became economically impossible. Urban decline followed rural collapse. Cities that had flourished for centuries emptied within decades as trade networks disintegrated. The great Roman road system, once bustling with merchants and travelers, carried only refugees and deserters. Roadside inns closed for lack of customers. Bridges collapsed without maintenance. Bandit groups controlled entire stretches of formerly safe highways. But economic collapse was merely the symptom. The disease was deeper, more fundamental, more destructive than any external enemy could inflict. Rome had forgotten why it existed. The early Romans fought for their families, their gods, their republic. They endured hardship for future generations. They sacrificed individual comfort for collective survival. They believed their cause was just and their victory divinely ordained. By the 3rd century, Romans fought for pay, and often they didn't even receive that. Entire legions mutinied, not from cowardice, but from hunger. Soldiers, who hadn't been paid in months, had no reason to risk death for emperors they'd never seen in service of policies they didn't understand. Military loyalty became transactional rather than patriotic. Barbarian foederati served Rome as long as Roman gold continued flowing. When the gold stopped, their loyalty stopped. Some Germanic units simply walked away from their posts and returned home. Others sold their services to the highest bidder, whether Roman or anti-Roman. The citizen soldiers who had conquered Gaul and defeated Carthage were replaced by barbarian mercenaries who fought skillfully but understood nothing of Roman values or Roman civilization. These warriors could win battles, but they couldn't inspire conquered populations to become Roman themselves. Social stratification hardened into caste system rigidity. The senatorial class withdrew from public service into private luxury. Senators who had once competed for the honor of governing provinces now avoided such appointments. As financial disasters, the costs of provincial administration exceeded the benefits of provincial office. The equestrian class, traditionally Rome's business leaders, pursued commerce over civic duty. But commerce itself was increasingly local rather than imperial. Long-distance trade became too risky and unprofitable as transportation costs soared and currency values collapsed. The plebs, once proud Roman citizens who had demanded representation and earned rights, became clients dependent on imperial charity. Free grain distributions fed over 300,000 people in Rome alone. Free entertainment distracted urban populations from economic hardship and political powerlessness. Roman engineering, once the marvel of the world, stagnated under bureaucratic paralysis. The great aqueducts were maintained, but no new ones were built. Roman roads were repaired, but no new ones were constructed. The innovative spirit that had created the Pantheon and conquered Britain was suffocated by regulation and risk aversion. Diocletian's edict on maximum prices, issued in 301 AD, attempted to control inflation. Through price controls, the edict fixed maximum prices for over 1,000 goods and services, from wheat and wine to haircuts and wagon transport. Violations were punishable by death. Economic law proved stronger than imperial law. Price controls created shortages, black markets, and further economic disruption. Merchants stopped selling goods at artificially low prices. Farmers stopped producing crops that couldn't be sold profitably. The edict was quietly abandoned within a few years, but the damage too economic. Confidence was permanent. Roman law itself became increasingly complex and contradictory. The legal system that had once been noted for clarity and consistency now required specialized lawyers to navigate. Justice became expensive, time-consuming, and uncertain. Common people couldn't afford legal representation while wealthy defendants bought favorable verdicts. Legal corruption spread through every level of government. Provincial governors bought their positions and recouped the investment through taxation and bribes. Judges sold verdicts to the highest bidder. Military commanders sold commissions and promotions. The army that had once been Rome's greatest strength became a parasite feeding on the empire it was supposed to protect. Perhaps most telling of all, Romans stopped having children. The Julian marriage laws had tried to encourage procreation through tax incentives and penalties, but birth rates continued to plummet throughout the imperial period. Roman families, facing economic uncertainty and social chaos, chose not to invest in the future. Archaeological evidence suggests that urban Roman populations weren't replacing themselves by the 2nd century AD. Rural populations declined even more dramatically. The empire that had once prided itself on growing strength now struggled to replace its own human resources. Foreign immigration partially offset population decline, but these new residents often maintained their original cultural identities rather than assimilating into Roman civilization. German settlers established Germanic communities. Slavic immigrants spoke Slavic languages. Syrian merchants practiced Syrian customs. The Roman military reflected this broader demographic transformation. By 300 AD, the majority of Roman soldiers were non-Roman in origin. Germanic warriors served under Germanic commanders. Illyrian units followed Illyrian traditions. The Roman army became a collection of ethnic militias united only by common pay and shared enemies. These soldiers were often superior fighters to the Roman citizens they replaced, but they served Rome without becoming Roman themselves. When their units were stationed in Gaul, they remained Germanic. When they were posted to Britain, They remained delirium. Military service no longer transformed barbarians into Romans. It simply armed barbarians with Roman weapons. Roman education declined along with Roman identity. The grammatical schools that had once taught rhetoric, philosophy, and civic virtue to provincial elites produced fewer graduates each generation. Latin literacy declined even in Roman cities. Greek learning survived primarily in the Eastern Empire. Technical knowledge began disappearing with alarming speed. The mathematical skills required for Roman engineering were preserved in increasingly small circles of specialists. When these experts died without training successors, their knowledge died with them. Roman concrete, Roman metallurgy, Roman surveying practical skills that had built an empire became rare and eventually forgotten arts. Roman religion fragmented into competing mystery cults that promised individual salvation rather than collective prosperity. Mithraism attracted soldiers. The Isis cult appealed to women. Christianity offered hope to slaves and poor. Judaism provided identity to ethnic communities. Each of these religions served important psychological needs, but none of them promoted Roman civic virtue or Roman imperial identity. Religious diversity weakened social cohesion rather than strengthening it. Romans prayed two different gods for different purposes while losing faith in Rome itself. The barbarian tribes beyond the frontier noticed these internal changes. Gothic merchants who traded with Roman cities reported on Roman weaknesses. Germanic warriors who served in Roman armies learned Roman tactics and Roman deficiencies. Frankish ambassadors observed Roman court politics and Roman divisions. These barbarian peoples weren't savage primitives. They were organized societies with their own laws, customs, and military traditions. Many had been in contact with Roman civilization for generations. Some Germanic leaders spoke Latin and understood Roman politics better than many Roman citizens. They saw Roman wealth defended by non-Roman soldiers. They saw Roman cities populated by non-Roman immigrants. They saw Roman leaders more interested in personal survival than imperial glory. They saw opportunity. The empire that had once transformed barbarians into Romans now offered barbarians the chance to become Romans without transformation. All they needed was the strength to take what Rome no longer had the will to defend. Enemies without chaos within the barbarians came, but Rome had already surrendered its soul. The Germanic tribes pressing against Rome's frontiers weren't savage hordes driven by inexplicable wanderlust. They were organized societies seeking land, security, and opportunity in response to specific pressures and attractions that Roman policy had helped create. Climate change during the 4th century had made traditional Germanic farming less reliable. Archaeological evidence shows crop failures and population stress throughout northern Europe. Simultaneously, the Hunnic Confederation, under pressure from Asian steppe peoples, was pushing westward, displacing Germanic tribes from traditional territories. These displaced peoples looked south toward Roman lands that offered everything their homelands lacked: warmer climate, fertile soil, established cities, functioning trade networks, and visible wealth. Roman merchants had been trading with Germanic communities for centuries, creating economic relationships and cultural knowledge that made Roman territories familiar rather than foreign. Many Germanic leaders had served in Roman armies, earning citizenship and understanding Roman military strengths and weaknesses from inside the system. Stilicho, half-Vandal by birth, commanded Western Roman armies for over a decade. Alaric had led Gothic foederati in Roman service before turning against his former employers, the Goths. Crossed the Danube in 376 AD not as conquerors, but as refugees fleeing the Huns. They petitioned Emperor Valens for permission to settle in Roman territory, offering military service in return for land and protection. This was traditional Roman policy: transform potential enemies into allies through controlled immigration and military recruitment. Rome's response revealed how far imperial administration had deteriorated from its inclusive origins. Instead of integrating the Goths as Rome had once integrated the Gauls and Germans, Roman officials treated them as temporary problems to be exploited for immediate profit. Roman merchants sold the Goths rotten food at inflated prices. Roman administrators demanded bribes for basic services. Roman commanders used Gothic warriors as expendable shock troops in internal Roman conflicts. The Gothic leadership, which had approached Rome as suppliants seeking partnership, found themselves treated as criminals and victims. Gothic rebellion was inevitable and justified. These weren't barbarian savages rejecting civilization. They were potential Roman citizens responding to Roman betrayal. At Adrianople in 378 AD, Gothic cavalry destroyed a Roman army and killed Emperor Valens himself. The empire that had once turned enemies into citizens had turned potential citizens into enemies. But external pressure was only half the story of Rome's collapse. The empire was simultaneously tearing itself apart from within through civil wars that were more destructive than any barbarian invasion. The 3rd century witnessed the crisis of the 3rd century, 50 emperors in 50 years, most dying violent deaths. Some reigned for months, some for weeks, some for days. The imperial throne became a death sentence rather than a position of honor. Diocletian's solution, dividing the empire between 4 co-emperors, was supposed to solve administrative problems through more efficient governance. Instead, it institutionalized Rome's fragmentation and created 4 separate power centers with competing interests and conflicting policies. The Western Empire, ruled from Milan or Ravenna, focused on defending Gaul and Britain against Germanic incursions. The Eastern Empire, ruled from Constantinople, concentrated on maintaining control over wealthy Asian and Egyptian provinces. These 2 halves of the same empire increasingly viewed each other as competitors rather than partners. Regional armies fought each other more often than they fought foreign enemies. The Rhine legions battled the Danube legions over imperial succession. The Syrian armies marched against the Egyptian armies over religious disputes. The Gallic forces clashed with the Italian forces over taxation and resources. While Romans killed Romans in civil wars, the frontiers lay undefended. Barbarian raiders crossed and guarded borders to find Roman territories empty of Roman soldiers. Germanic settlers established communities in abandoned Roman lands without facing organized resistance. Provincial governors declared themselves independent emperors when central authority weakened. Postumus established the Gallic Empire that controlled modern France, Germany, and Britain for 15 years, the Palmyrene Empire. Under Queen Zenobia ruled Syria, Egypt, and much of Asia Minor. The unity that had been Rome's greatest strength shattered into competing fragments. Military recruitment became desperate as Roman citizens avoided service and provincial populations resisted conscription. Landowners hid their sons or mutilated them to avoid military duty. Urban populations fled to the countryside to escape recruiting officers. The Roman army that had once attracted the best young men now struggled to find anyone willing to serve. Barbarian foederati filled the recruitment gap, but these foreign soldiers served for gold. Rather than glory, Germanic units maintained their tribal organization and customs. Hunnic cavalry followed their own battle tactics. Allan archers spoke their own languages. The Roman army became a coalition of ethnic militias with little loyalty to Rome itself. These barbarian soldiers were often superior warriors to the Romans they replaced. Germanic infantry techniques had evolved through centuries of intertribal warfare. Hunnic cavalry tactics were more flexible than traditional Roman formations. Gothic siege methods were more advanced than older Roman engineering, but military effectiveness wasn't the same as political loyalty. Barbarian units served Rome as long as Roman pay arrived regularly. When imperial finances collapsed and military salaries fell into arrears, these units had no emotional attachment to Roman survival. Some barbarian commanders realized they could rule Roman territories more effectively than Roman administrators. Why serve a corrupt, bankrupt empire when you could replace it with efficient, profitable kingdoms? Odoacer's deposition of Romulus Augustulus wasn't barbarian conquest of Rome. It was barbarian assumption of Roman responsibilities. Economic warfare accompanied military conflict as different regions of the empire imposed trade barriers against each other. Gallic provinces refused to ship grain to Italy. Egyptian merchants boycotted Syrian markets. British wool couldn't reach Mediterranean buyers. The economic integration that had sustained Roman prosperity dissolved into protective regionalism. Currency became regional rather than imperial. Different parts of the empire minted different coins with different silver content and different exchange rates. A merchant traveling from Spain to Syria needed multiple currencies and faced unpredictable conversion costs at every border. The Hunnic Confederation under Attila exploited these Roman divisions with sophisticated diplomatic strategy. Rather than simply attacking Roman territories, Attila played different parts of the empire against each other while extracting tribute from both Eastern and Western governments simultaneously. Attila allied with Germanic tribes inside the Roman Empire while negotiating with Roman generals who were fighting other Roman generals. He understood that Rome's greatest weakness wasn't military inferiority but political fragmentation. United, Rome could still defeat any external enemy. Divided, Rome was vulnerable to anyone clever enough to exploit its internal contradictions. The Hun-Roman relationship perfectly illustrated how completely Rome's strategic situation had reversed. Where Rome had once dictated terms to barbarian peoples, now barbarian leaders dictated terms to Rome. Attila received annual tribute from both Eastern and Western empires, protection money paid by the world's former superpower. To avoid destruction by nomadic cavalry, when Attila demanded the hand of Honoria, sister of Western Emperor Valentinian III, in marriage, along with half the Western Empire as dowry, he wasn't making a ridiculous proposal. He was negotiating from a position of strength that reflected real power relationships. The sack of Rome by Alaric in 410 AD shocked the contemporary world, but it shouldn't have surprised anyone who understood Rome's internal decay. Alaric had served Rome faithfully for years as a foederati commander, only to be betrayed by imperial court politics that promised payment and citizenship but delivered neither. Alaric's Goths weren't foreign invaders. They were Roman auxiliary troops whose contracted payments had been stopped by bureaucratic infighting. Their attack on Rome was a labor dispute escalated to military action, not barbarian conquest of civilization. When the Vandals sacked Rome again in 455 AD, they found a city that had already hollowed itself out from within. Pope Leo I, not the Roman emperor, negotiated with Genseric the Vandal to limit the destruction. Papal authority was replacing imperial authority even in Rome itself. The Eternal City survived, but as a Christian center rather than an imperial capital. By 450 AD, the Western Roman army was majority barbarian, commanded by barbarian generals, serving barbarian political interests. Ricimer, a half-Suevian, half-Visigothic general, controlled Western imperial policy for 20 years, deposing and installing emperors at will. These barbarian kingmakers weren't destroying Roman civilization. They were inheriting it. Many had grown up within the Roman system, understood Roman law, spoke Latin fluently, and respected Roman cultural achievements. They simply recognized that they could govern Roman territories more effectively than the Romans themselves. The transformation was gradual and often collaborative rather than sudden and violent. Germanic tribes established kingdoms within former Roman provinces, maintaining Roman administrative structures and Roman legal traditions while replacing Roman officials with Germanic rulers. The fall of a world without Rome. When Rome burned, knowledge turned to ash and silence ruled the West. On September 4th, 476 AD, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a teenage boy whose name was cruelly prophetic, Romulus Augustulus, little Romulus Augustus. The empire that began with Romulus ended with his namesake, and the title that began with Augustus ended with its diminutive. But this wasn't a dramatic conquest worthy of Hollywood epic. There were no siege engines at the gates, no climactic battles in the Forum, no heroic last stands on the Seven Hills. Odoacer simply informed the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople that the West no longer needed its own Augustus. The Western Roman Empire ended not with a bang, but with administrative correspondence. The immediate aftermath was catastrophic beyond anything Europe had experienced since the Bronze Age collapse. Without Roman administration, trade networks that had operated for centuries collapsed within decades. The commercial relationships that connected Britain to Egypt, Spain to Syria, disappeared overnight as local strongmen imposed tariffs, bandits controlled roads, and currency became worthless. Cities that had flourished for half a millennium emptied within generations. Urban infrastructure failed without imperial maintenance. Aqueducts that had supplied fresh water for centuries cracked and leaked, leaving city populations dependent on wells and rivers. Public bathhouses closed, sewage systems backed up, street paving crumbled. The amenities that had made Roman cities attractive places to live disappeared within decades. The population of Western Europe plummeted in what historians call the late antique Little Ice Age. Archaeological evidence suggests some regions lost 50–70 of their inhabitants within a century of Rome's fall. This wasn't just political upheaval. It was demographic catastrophe on a scale rarely seen in human history. Disease played a major role in this population collapse. The Justinian plague, which struck from 541 to 549 AD, killed an estimated 25–40 of the remaining population in some areas. Without Roman medical knowledge, public health systems, or long-distance trade in medicines, epidemic diseases devastated communities that had no immunity or treatment options. Agricultural productivity declined dramatically as Roman farming techniques were forgotten and irrigation systems collapsed. The specialized crops that had supported Roman trade wine, olive oil, garum fish sauce gave way to subsistence farming of basic grains. Agricultural surplus, which had supported urban populations and specialized crafts, largely disappeared. Libraries burned or rotted from neglect throughout the former Western Empire. The great collection at Alexandria had already been diminished by religious conflicts and budget cuts, but now countless smaller libraries across Europe simply vanished. Books required constant copying to survive in a pre-printing world, but who would pay scribes when basic survival was uncertain? Works by Livy, Tacitus, Suetonius, and hundreds of other Roman authors survived only in fragments, if at all. We possess only 35 of Livy's 142 books on Roman history. Most of Tacitus's historical works are lost. Entire genres of Roman literature, comedies, technical manuals, philosophical treatises exist only as references in other texts. Greek scientific and mathematical knowledge fared even worse in the Latin West. The Greek texts that preserved Euclidean geometry, Ptolemaic astronomy, and Galenic medicine were no longer copied or translated. European intellectual development was set back centuries by the simple failure to maintain libraries. Literacy plummeted throughout former Roman territories. In Roman Gaul, inscriptions show widespread literacy even among craftsmen and farmers. By 600 AD, literacy was largely confined to clergy, and even many priests couldn't read fluently. The written law that had been Rome's great gift to civilization was replaced by oral tradition and personal relationships. Legal systems fragmented into local customs and tribal traditions. Roman law, with its emphasis on written precedent and rational procedure, gave way to Germanic law codes based on personal status and blood relationships. Trial by ordeal replaced trial by evidence. Compensation replaced punishment. Justice became personal rather than institutional. Technological knowledge vanished with stunning speed. Romans had built structures requiring advanced mathematics, engineering, and metallurgy. Within centuries, European builders couldn't replicate Roman concrete, construct comparable domes, or engineer similar aqueducts. The Pantheonese dome remained the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome until the Renaissance over 1,000 years later. This wasn't just architectural regression. It was the loss of accumulated technical knowledge that had taken centuries to develop. Metalworking declined from Roman industrial levels to medieval craft production. Roman mines in Spain and Britain were abandoned as the knowledge of deep shaft mining and ore processing disappeared. Iron production fell to local blacksmith levels. Steel became rare and expensive rather than common and reliable. Long-distance trade, which had connected Britain to India under Roman rule, contracted to regional exchanges. The standardized weights, measures, and currencies that had facilitated Mediterranean commerce were replaced by local systems that varied between villages. A merchant who could once travel from Britain to Egypt using Roman roads, Roman currency. And Roman law now faced dozens of different rulers, currencies, legal systems, and languages in the same journey. The transaction costs of long-distance trade became prohibitive for all but the most valuable goods. Road systems deteriorated without imperial maintenance. The Roman road network had required constant repair, drainage maintenance, and bridge construction. Local communities lacked the resources and expertise to maintain these sophisticated transportation systems. By 600 AD, many Roman roads were impassable to wheeled traffic. Bridges collapsed and weren't rebuilt. Mountain passes became dangerous as guard posts were abandoned. The infrastructure that had enabled Roman military control and economic integration crumbled into local footpaths. Urban civilization almost disappeared from Western Europe. The Roman city, with its forums, theaters, bathhouses, schools, and markets, had been the center of civilized life. Post-Roman settlements were typically fortified villages focused on agriculture and basic crafts. Rome itself, which had housed over 1 million people at its peak, held fewer than 50,000 by 550 AD. The Forum Romanum, where Cicero had delivered orations and Caesar had planned conquests, became a cow pasture called the Campo Vicino. Marble columns were burned for lime. Bronze statues were melted for weapons. The physical remains of Roman glory became raw materials for survival. Yet the Eastern Roman Empire survived this catastrophe and continued for another 1,000 years. Constantinople maintained libraries, schools, universities, and administrative continuity. Byzantine scholars preserved Greek and Roman texts that would otherwise have been lost forever. But the Eastern Empire was increasingly Greek in culture, Orthodox in religion, and Asian in orientation. It preserved Roman law and Roman titles, but not the Roman civilization that the West had known. The universal empire that had once connected three continents became a regional power focused on survival. The barbarian kingdoms that replaced Rome in the West weren't necessarily hostile to Roman culture or Roman people. Theodoric the Great, who ruled Italy from 493 to 526, actively tried to preserve Roman institutions, Roman law, and Roman learning. His court included Roman senators, Roman scholars, and Roman administrators. But these preservation efforts were individual initiatives dependent on enlightened rulers, not systematic cultural programs. When Theodoric died, his efforts to maintain Roman civilization died with him. Gothic wars with the Byzantine Empire destroyed much of what he had tried to preserve. Similar patterns repeated across the former Western Empire. Visigothic Spain maintained some Roman legal traditions. Frankish Gaul preserved some Roman administrative practices. But these were fragments of Roman civilization, not continuations of it. The Catholic Church became the primary preserver of Roman culture in the West, but this preservation was selective and often accidental. Monasteries copied religious texts that happened to be written on the backs of classical manuscripts. Bishops used Roman administrative techniques to govern dioceses. But systematic preservation of Roman learning wasn't a church priority. Perhaps most tragically, the fall of Rome represented the loss of a unique historical experiment, a multi-ethnic, cosmopolitan civilization based on law rather than ethnicity, merit rather than birth, citizenship rather than tribal membership. Roman citizenship had transcended racial and cultural boundaries. A Spaniard, a Gaul, a Syrian, and an African could all be equally Roman, sharing common rights and responsibilities regardless of their ethnic origins. This inclusive vision of human organization wouldn't reappear in European civilization for over a millennium. The silence that followed Rome's fall was deeper than political chaos or economic disruption. It was the silence of lost knowledge, abandoned ambitions, and forgotten possibilities. Europe entered what later scholars would call the Dark Ages not because the period was uniformly barbaric, but because so little light from classical learning survived to illuminate medieval understanding. Empires don't die in battle. They die when they forget why they exist. Rome's collapse wasn't caused by barbarian invasion, military defeat, or natural disaster. Those were symptoms, not causes. Rome fell because it had lost the civic virtues that created it: discipline, sacrifice, public service, and belief in something greater than individual comfort. The historian Edward Gibbon, writing in the 18th century, identified moral decay as Rome's fundamental weakness. The decline of Rome was the natural and inevitable effect of immoderate greatness. Prosperity ripened the principle of decay. The causes of destruction multiplied with the extent of conquest. And as soon as time or accident had removed the artificial supports, the stupendous fabric yielded to the pressure of its own weight. Gibbon was partially correct, but his analysis was incomplete. Rome didn't fall from excessive size. The Eastern Empire was equally large and survived for another 1,000 years. Rome fell from internal, hollowing from the gradual replacement of civic virtue with private vice, public duty with personal pleasure, shared sacrifice with individual indulgence. The Rome that conquered the Mediterranean was a republic of citizen soldiers who served without pay, generals who returned to their farms after victory, and politicians who competed to serve the public good. The Rome that fell was an empire of professional armies serving for gold, leaders pursuing personal wealth, and citizens demanding bread and circuses from the state. This transformation took centuries, but its direction was consistent. From citizenship to spectatorship, from participation to consumption, from responsibility to entitlement, Romans gradually stopped believing in Rome itself. The Roman senator Tacitus, writing as the empire reached its zenith under Trajan, already sensed the danger in imperial success. They make a desert and call it peace. When Roman expansion became mere exploitation, when Roman governance became extractive rather than inclusive, the empire lost its legitimacy among its own people. Marcus Aurelius, the last of the great emperors, understood that empires are psychological constructs as much as political ones. Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking. Rome ceased to be happy with itself, ceased to believe in its own mission, ceased to inspire its citizens to greatness. The philosopher emperor's meditations, written during military campaigns on the Danube frontier, reveal a man grappling with the meaning of imperial power. Remember that very little disturbs the balance of nature, and that nature always seeks equilibrium. Rome had lost its balance between power and responsibility, wealth and virtue, success and purpose. The parallels to modern Western civilization are unavoidable and unsettling. Like Rome, the contemporary West enjoys unprecedented prosperity, military dominance, and cultural influence. Like Rome, it faces internal polarization, economic inequality, civic disengagement, and loss of shared purpose. Modern Americans consume entertainment while their infrastructure decays, just as Romans watched gladiatorial games while their aqueducts crumbled. Modern Europeans rely on immigrant workers for essential services, just as Romans depended on barbarian foederati for frontier defense. Modern democracies witness declining voter participation and civic knowledge, just as the Roman Republic saw citizens retreat from public life into private pleasure. Contemporary political leaders compete for personal advancement rather than public service, just as late Roman senators pursued wealth and status over institutional responsibility. Modern military forces struggle with recruitment as citizens avoid service, just as late Roman legions filled their ranks with foreign mercenaries. Economic inequality in modern Western societies approaches levels that characterized late imperial Rome. Technological innovation increasingly concentrates in narrow specialties while basic infrastructure and education deteriorate. Cultural confidence gives way to relativism and self-doubt. But history is not destiny, and these parallels are warnings, not prophecies. Rome fell because it made specific choices at critical moments, choosing comfort over duty, entertainment over engagement, extraction over integration, consumption over production. These were human decisions, not inevitable forces. The lesson Rome offers isn't that all empires must fall, but that survival requires constant renewal of founding principles. The moment any civilization believes its prosperity is permanent, its power unassailable, its culture superior by nature rather than achievement, that moment marks the beginning of its decline. Rome ruled the Mediterranean for centuries because it offered something valuable to conquered peoples: law, order, opportunity, and identity that transcended tribal boundaries. Romans could make Gauls into Romans, Germans into Romans, Africans into Romans. When Rome stopped offering these benefits, when it became a system that enriched elites while impoverishing everyone else, its subjects had no reason to defend it. The barbarians who replaced Rome weren't more virtuous, more intelligent, or more capable than Romans. They were simply hungrier for land, for dignity, for the opportunities that Romans no longer valued sufficiently to protect. Modern China studies Roman history intensively, seeking to understand how a great empire can maintain power without succumbing to the internal decay that destroyed Rome. Chinese leaders understand that material prosperity alone doesn't ensure political survival. Civilizations must maintain the cultural confidence and civic virtue that enabled their original success. The European Union explicitly models itself on Roman precedents, seeking to create a multinational political system based on law rather than force, economic integration rather than military conquest. But European leaders also recognize the Roman warning: unity requires more than administrative efficiency. It requires shared identity and common purpose. The United States Constitution incorporates Roman Republican principles while attempting to avoid Roman imperial pitfalls. American founders studied Roman history carefully, understanding both Roman achievements and Roman failures. But constitutional design cannot guarantee institutional survival without citizen virtue. Seneca, advisor to emperors and philosopher of human nature, warned that every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end. Rome's end created space for new beginnings: Christianity, Islam, medieval kingdoms, Renaissance city-states, modern nation-states. But at the cost of centuries of lost progress and human suffering, the barbarian successor kingdoms preserved fragments of Roman law, Roman culture, and Roman knowledge, but they couldn't preserve the integrated Roman system. Medieval Europe was poorer, more violent, and less sophisticated than Roman Europe had been. The Dark Ages weren't uniformly dark, but they were measurably darker than the Roman zenith. Recovery took a millennium. The Renaissance rediscovered Roman texts. The Enlightenment revived Roman political concepts. The Industrial Revolution exceeded Roman engineering achievements. But this recovery required centuries of gradual rebuilding that could have been avoided if Rome had maintained its civic health. The ruins of Rome still stand throughout Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, weathered by time but refusing to disappear entirely. Hadrian's Wall still crosses northern England, the Pont du Gard still spans French valleys, the Colosseum still dominates the Roman skyline. These monuments remind us that human achievement is possible but fragile, magnificent but mortal. Roman law still underlies most Western legal systems. Romance languages still echo Latin grammar and vocabulary. Roman architectural principles still influence modern buildings. Roman engineering techniques still inspire contemporary projects. Roman political concepts still shape democratic institutions. But these survivals are fragments, not continuations. We inherit pieces of Roman civilization without inheriting the Roman spirit that created them. We benefit from Roman achievements without understanding the Roman character that made those achievements possible. The question facing every contemporary civilization is fundamental. Will we learn from Rome's example, or will we repeat its mistakes? Will we maintain the virtues that create prosperity, or will we assume prosperity maintains itself? Will we preserve the institutions that protect freedom, or will we take freedom for granted until it vanishes? Rome's greatest gift to posterity isn't its roads, its laws, or its monuments. It's the warning carved into history itself. No empire is too great to fall, no civilization too advanced to collapse, no people too sophisticated to destroy themselves through their own success. The warning is written in stone across 3 continents, preserved in texts across dozens of languages, embedded in institutions across centuries of human development. But warnings only matter if someone listens. When Rome fell in silence, history began to whisper. The question that will determine our own civilization's fate is simple but urgent. Are we listening? Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. George Santayana.